October 29th, 1944, 0610 hours, Szeged, southern Hungary. The first light of dawn struggled to break through a sky thick with smoke. Anna Kovács clutched her son Miklós beneath a broken wall, her arms trembling as artillery shook the ground. For weeks, the Germans had fortified the city, turning every street into a battlefield, every home into a stronghold. The Soviets were advancing from the east, and everyone knew what their arrival meant: reprisals, chaos, and death. But it wasn't the Russians who reached Szeged first. It was the Americans, and what happened next would defy everything Anna had been told about the so-called foreign devils from across the ocean. She had been told they were monsters, men without souls, destroyers who burned villages for pleasure. Propaganda posters nailed to cracked walls screamed warnings. The Americans will take your children. They will desecrate your homes. Mothers like Anna had repeated those warnings in whispers to their little ones, believing them to be true, because what else could they believe when the world around them was falling apart? Yet, when the rumble of armored vehicles filled the air that morning, the voices that followed were speaking English, calm, commanding, human. Through the shattered remains of a bakery window, she could see them. American soldiers, their uniforms covered in soot and mud, moving carefully between ruined buildings. One of them stopped, his gaze scanning the rubble. Then, in a voice loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, he shouted in halting Hungarian, "Gyerekek, emberek, segítunk, children, people, we'll help you." Anna froze. Her heart hammered. Could this be a trap? She pressed Miklós closer, but the boy stirred. He was 7 years old, his face pale and streaked with dust. "Mama," he whispered, "they don't sound angry." Before she could answer, the soldier's voice came again, gentler this time, pleading almost. "We're here to help. Please come out." And that was the moment Anna realized something impossible. These men weren't looking for enemies. They were looking for survivors. Private Jack Reynolds from Chicago was 21, a farm boy turned infantryman. He had been fighting across Europe for 9 months, through Normandy, through the Ardennes, and now here, in a country he barely knew existed before the war. His unit had been tasked with securing the area and evacuating civilians before the front collapsed entirely. When he saw the faint movement behind the wall, he dropped his rifle to the side and raised both hands. "It's okay," he said softly. "We're not here to hurt you." Anna's instincts screamed not to trust him. Everything she'd heard, every rumor she'd believed, told her to stay hidden. But Miklós, too curious for his own safety, peeked over the rubble. The boy's wide eyes met Jack's tired ones, and for a brief moment, war seemed to stop. The young soldier smiled and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, wrapped bar of chocolate, the first real chocolate Miklós had ever seen. He tossed it gently toward them. "Food," Jack said. "Safe." That single act broke through months of fear. Anna hesitated, then slowly stood, lifting her son with trembling arms. As she stepped out into the cold morning air, she half expected to be struck down. Instead, Jack waved her toward a nearby truck, where medics were tending to other families. Hungarian civilians, some wounded, some in shock, all receiving care from the same hands that had fought their former occupiers only days before. For the people of Szeged, this was beyond comprehension. Their government had told them that the Americans would enslave them, that no mercy would be shown to those caught in the path of liberation. But the truth unfolding before them was entirely different. American soldiers shared their rations, carried the injured, and protected children from sniper fire that still echoed across the rooftops. Sergeant William Bill Carter, the squad leader, kept watch as his men worked. He'd seen horror, towns reduced to ash, civilians buried beneath collapsed buildings. But what he saw in Hungary struck him differently. "They were terrified of us," he wrote later in a letter home, "not because of what we'd done, but because of what they were told we'd do." The look on their faces when they realized we were here to help, that's something I'll never forget. As the soldiers moved deeper into the ruined neighborhood, they found more survivors. Entire families huddled in cellars, convinced that the Americans were only pretending to be kind before killing them all. It took hours of patient gestures, water, food, blankets, to convince them otherwise. In one basement, two brothers, ages 9 and 11, refused to come out until a soldier named Eddie Morales began playing a harmonica. The soft tune echoed through the darkness, and when the boys finally emerged, one of them was crying, not from fear, but relief. The American rescue effort wasn't without danger. German snipers still lingered in the outskirts, firing at any movement. When Private Reynolds carried a wounded child from a collapsed home, a bullet tore through the wall, just inches from his head. Instead of retreating, he shielded the boy with his own body and kept moving. Later, when asked why he'd risked himself for strangers, he simply said, "Because someone had to." By nightfall, nearly 80 civilians had been rescued from the ruins of Szeged. For those who survived, the day became something they would speak about for decades. The disbelief never truly faded. Many of them would later recall how they had waited for cruelty, for punishment, only to find compassion. For the first time in years, they saw foreign soldiers act not as conquerors, but as protectors. And for the Americans, the experience was equally transformative. They had been trained to fight, not to save. But that day, in the shattered heart of Hungary, they discovered that courage didn't just mean pulling a trigger, it could also mean offering a hand. October 30th, 1944, 05:45 hours. The fog hung low over the river Tisa, blurring the ruins that stretched across the horizon. The air smelled of smoke, iron, and something faintly sweet, the remnants of burned wheat silos that had once fed the entire region. In the makeshift camp outside Szeged, American soldiers moved between rows of wounded civilians, distributing blankets, bread, and what little medicine they had left. The sound of distant artillery reminded everyone that safety was still a fragile illusion. Private Jack Reynolds sat beside the campfire, holding his helmet loosely in his hands. His uniform was caked with mud, his eyes red from exhaustion. Across from him, Sergeant Carter studied a map illuminated by a flickering lantern. Their orders were clear: secure the surrounding villages, rescue survivors, and move north. But something about this assignment felt different. Carter muttered, "You ever think maybe we're doing something more important than just fighting a war?" Jack nodded slowly. "Feels like it, Sarge. When I pulled that kid out of the rubble yesterday, he looked at me like I was some kind of angel. I ain't no angel, but maybe he needed to believe one existed." Nearby, Lieutenant James Halpin, a medic from New Jersey, was tending to a young woman whose leg had been shattered by debris. Her name was Ilona, barely 19, and she hadn't spoken since being rescued. He spoke to her softly, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "You're safe now," he repeated over and over as he cleaned the wound and wrapped it in gauze. She stared at him with wide eyes, fear mixed with confusion, until finally she whispered, "Miet, Szegites, why are you helping me?" Halpin paused, "Because that's what we came here to do." That night, the American camp became a sanctuary for those who had lost everything. Mothers held their children close while soldiers shared their rations. A corporal strummed a guitar, filling the cold air with soft music that made the darkness seem less endless. For many Hungarians, it was the first time in years they had slept without the sound of marching boots outside their doors. But not everyone trusted the Americans yet. In a cellar on the outskirts of the city, a group of civilians refused to leave, despite repeated calls from soldiers. Among them was Istvan Horváth, a former schoolteacher who had once taught English before the war. He listened to the distant American voices and felt his heart pull in two directions, fear on one side, hope on the other. Finally he stood and whispered to the others, "If they meant us harm, we'd already be dead. Let's see who they really are." When Istvan emerged from the darkness, his eyes met those of Corporal Eddie Morales, the same soldier who had played his harmonica to calm the frightened children the day before. "You speak English?" Morales asked with surprise. Istvan nodded slowly. "A little. Enough." That small bridge of language changed everything. Istvan became the Americans' interpreter, guiding them through the devastated neighborhoods, convincing terrified families that it was safe to come out. He later wrote in his journal, "The enemy spoke words of peace. I had no choice but to believe them." As the days passed, the Americans' presence spread beyond Szeged. Columns of jeeps rolled through the countryside, escorted by local guides who had once hidden from them in fear. The soldiers repaired roads, cleared mines, and distributed food. Children ran after the trucks, laughing and shouting, their laughter echoing like defiance against the silence of war. In one village north of Szeged, the Americans discovered a bombed-out orphanage. Inside, nearly 20 children were surviving on rainwater and scraps of bread. Their caretaker, Sister Margit, a nun in her 50s, had refused to abandon them even when shells rained down around the building. When the first American soldiers entered, she fell to her knees, assuming they had come to take the children away. Instead, they saluted her. Sergeant Carter personally carried 2 of the weakest children to the truck. "We'll get them food and medicine," he promised. Sister Margit's eyes filled with tears. "I prayed every night," she said in broken English. "I prayed for mercy." "You are." The answer Carter didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded and said, "Then I guess someone was listening." Word of these rescues spread quickly through the countryside. Civilians who had once hidden now approached American patrols willingly, offering what little they had in gratitude: fresh eggs, loaves of bread, even hand-sewn scarves. One farmer brought a bottle of homemade palinka and insisted the soldiers drink it as a sign of peace. Jack Reynolds laughed as the fiery liquid burned his throat. "Guess we're diplomats now," he joked. Still, not all encounters ended peacefully. Near the village of Minzent, an American convoy was ambushed by retreating German soldiers. The firefight lasted 15 minutes, but when it ended, 3 Americans were dead, and so were several German soldiers who had been using civilians as shields. Among the rescued was a young boy named Laszlo, who had been trapped beneath his dead parents. When Reynolds found him, the boy's face was streaked with ash and blood, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought you were the bad men," he said in Hungarian. Reynolds knelt, brushing dirt from the boy's hair. "No, kid," he murmured. "We're the other kind." That night, as the convoy returned to Szeged, silence filled the trucks. They had saved lives, but at a cost. The soldiers were learning that heroism wasn't clean. It was messy, heartbreaking, and often came too late for too many. Yet still, they pressed on. For the Hungarian civilians, the transformation was just beginning. They had lived for years under a regime that thrived on fear, told lies about the world beyond their borders, and convinced them that mercy was a foreign illusion. But in the faces of these weary young soldiers, tired, dirty, and unfailingly kind, they saw something they hadn't seen in years: humanity. In the weeks that followed, children began calling the Americans Angelferfiak, angel men. It started as a whisper, then spread from family to family. The Americans, unaware of the title, continued their work, never realizing that in the hearts of those they saved, they had become symbols of something far greater than victory. November 2nd, 1944, 09:30 hours. The roads leading out of Szeged were lined with wagons, bicycles, and barefoot families trudging through the cold morning mist. American vehicles rolled slowly alongside them, offering water, blankets, and rides to the weakest. The front was moving north, and the soldiers' mission was clear: evacuate civilians before the next German counterattack. But, as the convoy advanced, the men couldn't shake the feeling that their purpose had become something deeper than orders. They were no longer just fighting a war. They were holding together the fragile remains of humanity. Private Jack Reynolds rode in the back of a truck filled with children. The smell of wet straw and smoke mixed with the faint sweetness of chocolate rations the soldiers had handed out. Miklós, the boy he'd rescued days earlier, sat on his lap, playing with a pair of Reynolds' dog tags. "You take this," the soldier said softly, pressing the metal chain into the boy's hand. "You keep it safe for me, all right?" Miklós nodded solemnly. "And you come back for it?" Reynolds smiled. "Count on it." Up ahead, Sergeant Carter's jeep stopped near a church that had been hit by artillery. The steeple was gone, the stained glass shattered. Yet inside, he found a group of civilians gathered in prayer. Among them was a mother named Erzsébet and her 3 daughters, the youngest barely 4 years old. They had been hiding in the crypt since the shelling began. Carter knelt beside them and spoke gently through István, the interpreter. "You can come with us?" "It's safe now," but Erzsébet shook her head. "My husband, he's missing. I can't leave without him." Carter hesitated. "We'll help find him, but you can't stay here." That promise turned into one of the most dangerous rescue missions of their campaign. Local scouts reported that German stragglers had taken positions in a nearby farmhouse. If Erzsébet's husband was alive, that was where he'd be. Carter gathered a small team, Reynolds, Morales, and 2 others, and set out before dawn. The fog was thick, muffling their footsteps as they crept through the fields. When they reached the farmhouse, they heard shouting in German. Carter raised his hand. "We go in quiet," he whispered. Inside, the smell of gunpowder and blood was heavy. 2 German soldiers stood guard near the barn, their attention fixed on something inside. Carter motioned to Reynolds, who slipped around the side and peered through a gap in the boards. What he saw froze him in place. 3 Hungarian men, tied to a beam, one of them barely conscious. "That's him," István whispered from behind. "That's her husband." Carter signaled the team forward. It was quick and brutal. 2 shots, a shout, and silence. When the smoke cleared, the prisoners were free. The eldest, weak and barely able to stand, looked at his rescuers in disbelief. "You Americans?" he rasped. Carter nodded. "You're safe now." The man's name was Lajos. As they carried him out of the farmhouse, he kept repeating one word over and over: "Soda, soda." Miracle. When they returned to the church hours later, Erzsébet collapsed into her husband's arms, weeping. Carter turned away, giving them privacy. Reynolds exhaled, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Morales muttered, "That's the kind of thing you don't forget." Carter nodded. "You're damn right." That night, the Americans and civilians shared a small meal by lantern light. Bread, canned meat, and whatever the villagers could offer. Sister Margit, who had joined the convoy from the orphanage, led a quiet prayer of thanks. Even those who didn't understand her words could feel their meaning. For the first time in months, people laughed. The war wasn't over, but for that one night, it felt distant. In the following days, American engineers began repairing the bridges across the Tisa River. The destruction had cut off supplies, leaving villages isolated. Working alongside local farmers, the soldiers cleared debris, built makeshift crossings, and reopened wells. The cooperation was something few had imagined possible only weeks earlier. To the Hungarians, the sight of Americans rebuilding their communities instead of occupying them was almost surreal. "They came with guns," one villager remarked, "but their hands build, not destroy." The soldiers, too, felt the weight of what they were witnessing. Lieutenant Halpin wrote in his journal, "We fight to survive, but these people fight to live." There's a difference. Seeing them cling to hope makes you realize what this war should have been about from the start. By mid-November, the Americans had established what locals began calling the Corridor of Angels, a stretch of villages under American protection where civilians could find shelter, food, and medical aid. It was never official policy, just a mission born from compassion. Within weeks, over 2,000 civilians, Hungarian Jewish Roma, had been rescued. For many soldiers, the hardest part wasn't the fighting, but the leaving. As orders came to move further north, farewells filled the camp. Children hugged their rescuers. Old men pressed small keepsakes, coins, crosses, embroidered cloths into their hands. Sister Margit kissed each soldier's forehead and said, "May God keep you safe. You carry more than weapons. You carry hope." On the morning of their departure, as the convoy prepared to move, Miklós ran to Reynolds, clutching the dog tags he'd been given. "You said you'd come back," the boy said, eyes brimming with tears. Reynolds knelt, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And I will," he promised, though they both knew he couldn't be sure. As the trucks rolled out, the people of Szeged gathered along the road. Some waved flags stitched from torn fabric, others simply raised their hands in silent farewell. The soldiers looked back one last time and saw something they hadn't seen when they first arrived: smiles, real, unguarded smiles. The Americans had come to Hungary expecting enemies. They left having found friends. For the civilians, the shock of mercy had rewritten what they believed about the world. For the soldiers, it had redefined what it meant to win. November 14th, 1944, 07:30 hours. The Hungarian plains were silent except for the crunch of boots on frozen soil. The Americans had pushed north to the town of Hódmezővásárhely, a place scarred by weeks of fighting and bombardment. Houses stood roofless, churches gutted, and smoke still rose from the fields where tanks had burned. The convoy entered slowly, weapons ready, but what they found wasn't an ambush, it was a ghost town. Corporal Eddie Morales was the first to spot movement. A small hand lifted a torn curtain inside what had once been a tailor's shop. He called out softly, "Hello, we're not here to hurt you." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then a child, no older than 5, emerged, barefoot and shivering, clutching a stuffed toy, missing one eye. Behind her came her grandmother, trembling but defiant. "You are Americans?" she asked in broken English. Sergeant Carter nodded. "Yes, Mum." "We're here to help." Within the hour, more civilians began to emerge. Families had been hiding in basements for days, surviving on rainwater and canned beets. Some were wounded, others too weak to walk. American medics set up aid stations, turning church ruins into field hospitals. Lieutenant Halpin worked tirelessly, bandaging wounds, treating infections, and distributing the last of their morphine supplies. "We'll have to improvise," he told Carter, "but they're going to live." The stories the villagers told were harrowing. German soldiers retreating through the town had taken food and livestock, burning anything they couldn't carry. When the fighting reached the outskirts, Soviet shells began landing randomly, killing civilians who tried to flee. Those who remained had given up hope until they saw the white star painted on the side of the approaching American trucks. Among the rescued was a young mother named Juliana, her face streaked with soot. She had hidden in a root cellar with her 2 sons for nearly a week. When she saw the Americans, she whispered to her eldest, "They're real." For months she had believed the rumors that the Western soldiers were a myth, a lie told to give false hope. Yet here they were, handing out bread and blankets, their voices calm, their movements careful, as if afraid to break the fragile trust that had begun to form. Private Reynolds found himself assigned to guard the medical tent. Between tasks, he watched the civilians with quiet fascination. The children's laughter, faint and uncertain at first, began to fill the air again. A soldier shared his harmonica, and soon one of the boys was trying to mimic the tune. Reynolds grinned. Guess music's the one thing war can't destroy. But even as peace flickered in that ruined town, danger still lingered. Late that night, scouts reported movement along the eastern ridge, German remnants retreating under the cover of darkness. The Americans had a choice: abandon the civilians and pull back, or stay and risk an attack. Carter didn't hesitate. "We hold," he said firmly. "These people have nowhere else to go." When the attack came just before dawn, it was swift and violent. Mortar shells rained down, shattering what little remained of the town. Civilians screamed and scattered toward the old church where medics had set up shelter. Carter's men returned fire from makeshift barricades, outnumbered but determined. In the chaos, Reynolds spotted a fire breaking out near the medical tent. The roof was collapsing, and trapped inside were Juliana and her 2 sons. Without thinking, he sprinted through the smoke, covering his face with his jacket. Flames clawed at the air, and debris crashed around him, but he reached the children just as the roof gave way. He lifted the youngest into his arms, shouting over the roar of the fire, "Go! Move!" Juliana hesitated, her older boy frozen in fear. Reynolds pushed them toward the exit, shielding them with his body as burning beams fell inches away. Outside, Morales and Halpin dragged them to safety. Reynolds collapsed, coughing, his jacket smoldering. "You crazy bastard," Morales said, patting out the flames. Reynolds wheezed a laugh. "Didn't plan on barbecue today." The child clung to him, crying into his chest. Carter knelt beside them. "You did good, son," he said quietly. "Real good." By sunrise, the attack had ended. The Americans held their ground, and the remaining Germans retreated into the forests. When the smoke cleared, the townspeople emerged to find their protectors still standing guard, exhausted but unbroken. Juliana approached Reynolds and placed a small silver cross in his hand. "For you," she said. "You saved my family." He tried to refuse, but she insisted. "Please." To remember us that day became legend in the surrounding villages. Word spread that the Americans had not only fought off the enemy, but had shielded the townspeople with their own bodies. "They stood between us and death," one farmer would later recall, "as if we were their own." In the following days, the Americans continued their advance, bringing more civilians under their protection. The line between soldier and savior blurred completely. Even hardened men who had seen the worst of Europe began to change. Corporal Morales wrote in a letter home, "I thought this war was about winning. Now I think it's about proving we still have hearts." Everywhere they went, the Americans left traces of compassion: a rebuilt well, a mended roof, a loaf of bread wrapped in a uniform sleeve, and the Hungarians, who once trembled at their approach, began to greet them with open hands. Children waved paper flags, women brought fresh water, old men stood and saluted as convoys passed. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about gratitude for life, for mercy, for the impossible kindness of strangers. By late November, snow began to fall over the plains. The soldiers knew they'd be moving again soon, following the war north toward Budapest. But that night, in the glow of a campfire, as snowflakes melted on their jackets, Sergeant Carter looked around at his men and the civilians sleeping under their protection. "You see this?" he said quietly. "This right here. This is what winning looks like." November 30th, 1944, 22:15 hours. The American convoy was camped outside Kecskemét, a town caught between retreating German units and the oncoming Soviet front. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling every sound, but the cold air still carried the faint echo of distant artillery. For the civilians huddled inside the camp, each explosion was a reminder that safety was a fragile promise. Yet, within those makeshift tents, something extraordinary was happening. People who had been taught to fear Americans now slept under their protection, trusting them completely. Private Jack Reynolds sat beside a fire, his coat pulled tight, watching as Miklós drew patterns in the snow with a stick. The boy had barely spoken since they left Szeged, but tonight he looked peaceful. "You ever seen snow like this?" Reynolds asked. Miklós shook his head, smiling faintly. "Looks clean," he said softly, the English words slow and careful. Reynolds nodded. "Yeah, like the world's trying to start over nearby." Sergeant Carter and Lieutenant Halpin reviewed the latest orders. They were to move out at dawn. Budapest awaited, and intelligence reports warned of heavy resistance. The mission ahead would be brutal. But for now, Carter's focus remained on the civilians under their care. "We can't leave them here," he said. "If the Soviets hit this place before we're gone, they won't stand a chance." Halpin agreed. "Then we take them with us. Every last one." The next morning, the Americans formed what the locals began calling the Convoy of Mercy. Dozens of trucks, horses and carts filled with families moved through snow-covered roads, escorted by armed jeeps. The soldiers gave up their seats so the elderly could ride. They carried children on their backs when wagons broke down. And through it all, not a single civilian was left behind. At one point, the convoy reached a bridge that had been destroyed by retreating Germans. The river below was half frozen, black water cutting through ice like a wound. "We can't cross that," one driver said. Carter looked at the trembling civilians waiting behind him, then turned to his men. "We'll make a bridge." They worked for hours in freezing wind, cutting logs, dragging debris, using ropes and planks to build a makeshift crossing. One wrong step meant falling into icy water, but no one hesitated. When the last wagon rolled across safely, the crowd broke into applause. Sister Margit wept openly. "You are not soldiers," she said through tears. "You are saviors." That night, after the civilians had eaten, the soldiers gathered in a small barn to rest. Morales played his harmonica, filling the space with the same soft tune that had calmed terrified children weeks before. It echoed through the camp, gentle and haunting, carrying with it the shared exhaustion and strange peace that only war survivors could understand. Reynolds looked at Carter and said, "You think they'll remember us?" The sergeant smiled. "They'll remember the day Americans showed up and didn't take anything." That's enough, but the war wasn't done with them yet. As dawn broke, the sound of distant gunfire rolled across the horizon. Scouts reported that a German armored column was retreating through the nearby forest and headed straight toward their route. Carter ordered the civilians to take cover while his men formed a defensive line. They were outnumbered, under-equipped, and trapped between the river and the enemy. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. When the German tanks appeared, the Americans opened fire, using the terrain to their advantage. The battle raged for nearly an hour, snow and smoke blending into chaos. Civilians huddled behind carts and ruins, praying as bullets tore through the air. At the height of the fighting, a shell exploded near the convoy, toppling a wagon carrying children. Reynolds sprinted toward it, ignoring Carter's shout to stay back. He reached the overturned cart, pulling one child free, then another. As he turned to grab a third, another blast sent him sprawling into the snow. Carter and Morales dragged him to cover. Blood stained the snow near his shoulder, but he was alive. "You're not dying here," Carter said through gritted teeth, pressing a bandage to the wound. Reynolds forced a weak grin. "Didn't plan to." The soldiers held their ground until the last German tank retreated into the woods. When the smoke cleared, the civilians began to emerge once again, shaken, crying, but alive. In the aftermath, they gathered around the injured soldiers, offering water, food, and prayers. Juliana, the woman whose children Reynolds had saved, knelt beside him and placed the silver cross he had once tried to refuse back into his hand. "You gave us life," she said. "Now you must live too." Reynolds managed a faint smile. "Guess I don't have a choice." By nightfall, the battle was over. The Americans had held the line, and the civilians were safe. The soldiers buried their fallen beneath a nearby oak tree, marking the graves with simple wooden crosses. Sister Margit led a quiet service, her voice trembling as she prayed in Hungarian and English. "These men fought not for glory," she said, "but for goodness. And the world will not forget them." Weeks later, when the war finally ended in Hungary, word spread across the countryside about what the people of Szeged, Hódmezővásárhely, and Kecskemét had witnessed. The Americans who had risked their lives not to conquer, but to save. Mothers told their children the stories of the angelférfiak, the angel men who had come from across the ocean. For the soldiers, those memories followed them home. Carter returned to Kansas, where he became a teacher, often reminding his students that bravery was measured not by violence, but by compassion. Morales opened a small repair shop in San Antonio, his harmonica resting above the counter as a reminder of music that once kept hope alive. And Jack Reynolds, after months of recovery, received a letter written in careful English, signed simply Miklós Kovács. It said, "I still have your dog tags." Hungary remembers. In the end, the most astonishing truth was this: the Hungarian civilians never forgot the men who crossed oceans and battlefields to save their children. What began as disbelief became reverence, passed down through generations. They remembered not the sound of gunfire or the sight of tanks, but the kindness of strangers who proved that mercy could exist even in hell. Because sometimes the most powerful victories in war aren't written in history books. They're carried in the hearts of those who were saved. And that wraps up today's story about the Americans in Hungary who defied fear, propaganda, and death itself to protect innocent lives. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more untold stories of courage and humanity. Let us know in the comments. What do you think defines a true hero? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.